Oi, oi, it's your boy, the Sergei Spivak of waiting till the next day, starting at the end and watching these fights back. Jack Slack, it's the Jack Slack podcast. We're coming at you following UFC 311, and it was one I was very excited about. I wrote a big article called Lessons from Makhachev versus Tsarukyan 1. I released a boycast on it. I released a preview for the boycast called Makhachev versus Tsarukyan. Now that's what I call a fight. And then the fight fell through. The fight fell through a couple of hours before the weigh-ins, I believe. So, yeah, I mean, I was chatting to some people at a party, and I was just explaining. They were saying, "What's it like covering fighting?" And I said, "Well, let me tell you what can happen in this sport. One day before the event, you have to change all the advertising material for the event." John Anik did an interview where he said, "Now I'm going to be up all night recording new lines for the promo pieces and the stuff that plays during the undercard and so on." Obviously, drop in the bucket in terms of what the UFC is making money-wise, but a lot of work gets thrown out, and a lot of work has to be done again in the last minute. So it's never ideal for anyone. Not ideal for Makhachev or Moicano. I mean, Moicano gets a great opportunity there, but both of them trained for someone else entirely. Moicano definitely got more to win than he had to lose, and Makhachev actually had some risk attached to this. But really, we just lost a really interesting matchup. However, I felt like we gained a really interesting matchup. I said that when it happened, and I don't think Makhachev winning makes that any less true. It was still an interesting matchup. This is the thing, Makhachev's the best guy in the world. If he beats someone, I still wanted to see him beat them if they were a good fighter. We're in this stage of Makhachev where it's like Prime Anderson Silva, where people almost don't want to see the fights. They're like, well, he'd just easily win. It's like, no, man, I want to watch him win. That's why I do this. Unless you're just looking at the numbers and gambling on it and not really paying attention to the fights, you probably want to see Makhachev smash some top lightweights. And Moicano was on a really good run, which makes smashing him all the more impressive. So why don't we start there? Because it was quite a quick fight. There was a classic Makhachev slipped. While something about Moicano that I like in his boxing is that he throws counter combinations, which is something that even in decent levels of boxing, coaches go crazy about their fighters not doing enough. If you watch Moicano versus Riddell, who else did he crack on the counter? He might have actually done it against Jailton Turner, of all people. But when his boxing can look pretty slick, and I've said that, he's in his Maya phase. Damian Maia actually built some serviceable striking and then got too comfortable showing it off and went back to just an ultra wrestling heavy game plan of, I'm going to grapple people, that's what I'm good at, stick to what I'm good at. Which was interesting because most fighters are constantly trying to round themselves out and end up losing a bit of prowess in their, in the thing that got them famous while doing that. But Moicano's boxing can look quite good. He's a bit vulnerable on the feet, is what I'd say. But when he sees the punches coming, or he can avoid the punches, or he's on offense, all very good. So Makhachev lanced him with a left straight, threw another one later on, and Moicano threw back 3 or 4 punches in a row, and Makhachev was off balance and slipped, which can happen if you see the punch coming, but you're off balance and you try and avoid it anyway. You can end up falling over. And we got the standard, "Oh, he's hurt!" But they very quickly realised he wasn't, the commentary team. On the feet, this was very conservative Makhachev, who's always conservative anyway. He's not getting into brawls with people, with the exception of the Poirier fight. He's very measured. He's a sharpshooter on the feet. Then he shot low and long, hit Moicano's hips and ran up into what I've heard called a dresser dump or a trap hook dump, where you've picked up one leg, and instead of being able to get to the other leg, normally because the opponent blocks you with their arm, your other arm comes up and you basically clothesline them in the neck with your other arm. And you'll see guys go one way and then come back the other and try and turn the opponent like a big steering wheel. But Makhachev was able to just club him straight to the mat. Dom Cruz was good at that too, I think. And GSP is another great example. Go to YouTube and type in all GSP takedowns. There'll be a highlight. He does it a few times in that. But this one got me thinking about sequencing of techniques, which is something you see really good grapplers, either on purpose or by accident through unintentional synergies. They find themselves doing this. But if you watch the very best finishers among the best grapplers in the world, one move flows into the next. All their favorite moves land them into halfway into the next one, which sounds like just that sounds like something that all grappling is. But so let's take, for example, someone like Roger Gracie, famous for smashing his way into half guard, getting the crossface of death, the shoulder of justice, which is where you grab the head and you turn their chin away from you with your shoulder. He would use that to sneak his knee through from the half guard and mount. And as he tried to mount, the opponent would try and push his knee back into their guard, and he'd underhook that arm and walk it up and be in mount with the underhook on the arm, which means that you haven't just mounted and then the guy gets his elbows down and he's defending the mount now. You've mounted in position to start attacking. Arm triangles, collar choke, cross collar chokes is what Roger Gracie used to do in the gi. He was really good at the Ezekiel. But opening the guy's elbows from mount is key to that. So his passing game landed him halfway to finishing from the mount, rather than he passed and then he was in mount and he was like, right, let's get to work from mount. Another example would be someone like GSP, hit his double leg, flared the opponent and landed in half guard with the underhook ready to start crossface underhook passing. And the way that you see it is that you go, how did he manage to choke him so easily from mount or get his back so easily from there? And you go back and you go, oh, he already had his arm in position because he finished his last move ready to start his next move, which is something that is missing in a lot of fights. Guys pass guard and then they go, right, what am I doing now? And they just like reset to standard side control position or standard mount position. So Makhachev, when he hit this trap hook, clothesline, whatever you want to call it, this takedown, he already had his arm around Moicano's head and applying the crossface, which is halfway into passing from half guard into mount or side control, or looking for the Kimura, which Makhachev is probably his favorite move from top side control and top half guard. Moicano spent the time trying to fight his hands inside of that crossface, and he did in fact peel it off at one point. And this is where it got interesting. I've been saying for a while, I want to watch people turn off the fence against good cage wrestlers, whether it's Makhachev, Chimaev, whoever. Too many guys are going to the wall walk and then just getting stalled out in the wall walk or slowly giving up opportunities. Whereas guys have had success out in the open making stuff happen. So way back in the day, Makhachev fought Mansour Barnui, who had a lot of success out in the open. That was in a ring, to be fair. But then Mansour Barnui fought Shamil Zavarov, who's from Habib's camp. He's one of the older guys there, one of the guys who had success before Habib and Islam. And he had a ton of success turning himself off the fence and sweeping Zavarov out in the open, or wrestling up from there. Sarukian, in the first, well, I suppose at the moment only fight between Makhachev and Sarukian, he had success out in the open on the mat, on the bottom, scrambling up and using butterfly hooks and things. When he started to wall walk later on, he was just getting stuck there. So there are guys who've had success out in the open and not had success wall walking. There's Volkanovski's an interesting one because he had success wall walking by doing it slightly differently, but that's for another day. So it was interesting watching Moicano turn himself off the fence in this one. I know he is subscribed to the YouTube channel, so I'll take credit for this one where he got submitted. But it did work. He turned off the fence and he got his knees and feet in front of Makhachev, pushed him away, and then he started to sit up. And that's like, yeah, okay, great position, start wrestling up. But he got caught with a little snap down, crumpled over into Das, which is like, I think a lot of people would treat that as like, every time anyone ever attempts to kick out and stand up against Makhachev now, they're getting darsed. But this was just exceptional timing on Makhachev's part, and Moicano came up with his head low, a little bit stooped over, and once you get snapped down, it's quite hard. If you're out of position, it's quite hard to fight it back, which is what's so great about the darst stuff. But a lot of discussion about Makhachev's darst because he didn't used to do it much, and now he's submitted 2 guys in a row with it, which is quite interesting. One of the things that I've always admired about Makhachev is that he's constantly working and improving, and he's so different. Like there's a lot of stuff that stayed the same, but he's so different to how he was a few years ago. And he manages to not lose things. He manages to just sort of gain new bits and pieces without forgetting who he is, which is the really hard bit. Especially if a lot of these guys are trying to round themselves out, but a lot of these guys just find new things to do because they're bored, because this is a job that you're doing 24/7. Well, not 24/7, but you're doing 7 days a week, 6 days a week, whatever. You're in training, wrestling, sparring constantly. So people pick up new things because they desperately need something to do. But Makhachev's Dars is very interesting. It's he uses a short arm Dars that I've heard called a Hobbit Dars, and I quite like that. I think Jeremy Skinner called it a Hobbit Dars, but it's for people with short arms. If you can't lock your hand at the bicep like a rear naked choke grip, you lock it over the bottom of the forearm, just the forearm down by the elbow, or is that the top of the forearm? Whatever. There's a couple of other like mechanical details that are quite interesting in Makhachev's Dars. If you watch against Poirier, he traps the leg and he falls behind Poirier's head and crumples Poirier's head over sideways, which is effectively a Japanese necktie, which is a different kind of front headlock submission. But he has the arms figure forward for a Dars grip, so it goes down as a Dars, but it could be a Japanese necktie because it's mainly the sideways head crank. But this one looked a lot more like when the Dars was catching on. There were two sort of ways it was catching on. There was a guy called Joe D'Arcy who trained with John Danaher, and he started doing it in no-gi. But there was also a gi move where you unravel the opponent's lapel and pass it across him, and you essentially do the same thing as a Dars but one-handed, and that was called a brabo choke, which apparently means savage in Portuguese. And some Brazilian guys developed that into the Dars choke we know because it was taking a gi technique and trying to make it work in no gi. So Leo Vieira was very good at that, the Bravo choke. And if you watch Robert Drysdale's old DVDs back in the day, just after he won ADCC, he's a really interesting character, Drysdale. He does a load of work on the history of jiu-jitsu now, but I was really excited for his UFC career, but then he kept testing positive before he'd even had a fight. And this was in the days before any sort of real testing. But the way that he teaches the Dars, which is very interesting if you can find those old DVDs, a lot of guys want to get their arm as deep as possible, hug the bicep, bring everything tight, sprawl on the guy, squeeze the life out of him. Drysdale's like, no, I want the ridge of my wrist just below my thumb on their occipital. So like if you feel the back of your head, where it sort of goes in towards the back of your neck. So look at your hand, look at your thumb, follow it down to the knuckle of the thumb, then follow it down to the wrist to about where the strap of your watch would sit. You want that on the back of their occipital, and then you lock your hands and you, instead of sprawling on them, you pull your elbow up. So the bone just digs into the back of the head. And Drysdale put people to sleep with that, so it's a legit choke, but he was really stressing that the idea that it's just supposed to hurt people, and that seems to be what Makhachev did on this one and is doing. As people have pointed out rightly, the guys he's tapping out they're not tapping out like, oh, I'm about to go to sleep, go on then. They're tapping out like they're in a lot of pain and worried about being injured. So another sensational performance from Makhachev, undeniably, not just the best guy in the world, one of the best fighters I've ever seen skill-wise. We raised some questions about his resume because he does have 2 fights. When it comes to like getting the record for defending the lightweight title, 2 of those defenses will be against a featherweight and so on. People are like trying to pretend that this is the same as that he got number 7 ranked lightweight instead of number 2 ranked lightweight, but it's still a world-class lightweight who's been fighting at lightweight and proving himself at lightweight. But yes, Makhachev's the man. One of the interesting things about this fight is that the California State Commission releases purses. And if you point out, like, Makhachev has a $200,000 payout on that payout sheet. Everyone else's seems accurate. Makhachev, there's the question of pay-per-view points. Well, it's not really the question of pay-per-view points. We know that he's getting pay-per-view points. We don't know how much. We don't know, what percentage he gets of each pay-per-view buy, but he's probably making a lot more than $200,000. It is, however, crazy, and I pointed this out and people got really angry. I was like, how is it not embarrassing that boxers fight in California or wherever, and the purse is announced as X million? The best fighter possibly to ever do this in MMA gets an announced purse of $200,000. Which, when no one was watching Terence Crawford, he was getting like $5 million a fight. It would take Makhachev 25 fights to get that because he doesn't get a win bonus either if you just went on purses. Now you could do percentage of pay-per-view, but then that's like, I always think that's offensive to the fighter because the whole thing of the promoter is that they're supposed to be able to promote you. And then they're saying to you, well, if you bring in more buys, it's kind of like high-end way of saying, here, go and sell these tickets to your mates. But yes, everyone else's payouts, if you don't factor in, they don't get pay-per-view points, and they do look right. There's people turning up to say like, oh, in California they don't get paid because they actually hide it somewhere else. And you're like, well, that, if you do work in one state and then they pay you through a company in another state for something you did in that state, that's a financial crime, I believe. But more importantly, like, there are guys on here coming off the Contender Series whose payouts are 12 and 12. We know that the Contender Series contracts are 12 and 12. They are not hiding a secret payout from you. The only one with room for making more money on this is Makhachev. All the other shit purses are still just shit purses. Though it's pretty cool that Moicano got $250,000 for this, because that's probably not what he's normally making, and you want to see him rewarded for stepping in at the last minute against the best fighter in the world. Co-main event was Merab Dvalishvili versus Umar Nurmagomedov. I have to say, I've said previously, I don't find Merab Dvalishvili's style fun to watch. I feel like sometimes when he fights, his fight is to not have a fight happen. He overwhelms the guy with stuff coming at them, but doesn't really do damage, and just sort of prevents them from doing anything. But I have to say, I was blown away by his performance in this fight. And Umar, Umar, I'm pretty open about being like quite impressed with technically and strategically, and particularly in that Corey Sandhagen fight. I mentioned it in my technical turnaround award at the Slacky Awards because I thought he'd improved so much in the boxing, which Habib was on record saying like that's his weak area. But the first two rounds of this, Umar's doing decently. He's landing his jab, and that annoying question mark kick that Joe Rogan's always talking about but never lands. But the purpose of that is that it means that anytime Umar brings his knee up, it looks like he's going to do a kick, so he can do the knee raise and then step through punching, and that's how he hurt Merab a little bit in the first round. But Merab Dvalishvili, it's not a secret that cardio is the most valuable factor in a professional fight, particularly once you get into the longer professional fights of a championship fight in whatever sport. They're always longer, with the exception of that one Japanese kickboxing organization. No, Rise has 5 rounds, K1 has 3 for some reason. But it's almost a different sport because you're fighting almost double the number of rounds. So it's never been a secret that conditioning is the most important thing. George Foreman said it's the most important thing in boxing. In wrestling, Karl Gotch said conditioning is the greatest hold. Everyone knows. You've seen hundreds of guys do it. Sean Shirk did it back in the day. That was his whole thing at lightweight. But I've never seen anyone do it to the same degree that Merab Dvalishvili does. He's just a freak. He makes me think of that old long-distance runner. Was he a Czech guy? Zatopek, that's it. Yeah, he had absolutely horrendous running form. Looked bizarre running. But he won like 5 Olympic medals, 3 world championships. And the thing that people said about him was that he just loved running. He was just always out running. And if you see Merab's Instagram or whatever, he's always out doing something active. I think he's just a guy who is absolutely fine being tired and loves it. Whereas a lot of people, even with the Dagestanis working as hard as they do and taking so much pride in it, there's a difference between doing it because you have to do it to be the best and doing it just because you do it, just because you love tiring yourself out. Sean Shirk, I gave the example a minute ago, but he did it out of fear. He said in one of his first fights, he gassed out, and he said it was the most frightening thing he'd ever experienced, and he never wanted it to happen again. And so he just trained like an animal for the rest of his career. But for anyone who does that, has the cardio edge to such a degree, and the first couple of rounds are going to be a normal fight. But that feeling around minute 19, where the other guy stops fighting back, that's got to be great. When you're like, oh, it's my turn now. Or as Muhammad Ali famously said about fighting George Foreman, he said, brother, this is the wrong place to get tired. And it's incredible to observe that tipping point happen in real time. It was probably round 4. Merab had picked up the pace in round 3, but in round 4, there was a moment where Umar was fighting normally, and then there was a moment where he looked like, just leave me alone for a second, and that things just immediately went downhill. And then he came out at the start of the 5th, had a bit more energy because he'd had to sit down, and a breather, and no one in his face constantly going, oh, you better defend these takedowns. But then after a couple of minutes, it was back to looking like he didn't want to be there anymore. Because there is supposed to be no feeling as awful or frightening as being in a professional fight, getting tired and realizing the other guy isn't. So the technical stuff in this fight, there was actually a good amount that I liked. Because of the Southpaw versus Orthodox matchup, Umar being the Southpaw, you got to see Merab do a really simple entry that still works at the highest levels of the game over and over. Duck your head, throw the overhand, grab the leg at the same time. If you remember when Mousasi left the UFC, his triumphant arrival in Bellator was against Shlemenko, who was a overweight, old welterweight. But Shlemenko was southpaw, and he kept tapping the lead leg and throwing the left overhand, and he smashed Mousasi's eye right open. Lost the decision that he should have won, but that's neither here nor there. I'm the only person who remembers 7 years on or whatever. But it was an example of that was the only move that was really working for him, but it was carrying him through the fight. And Merab was doing the same here. It was just constantly threatening to level change on the lead leg, throwing the overhand, possibly grabbing the leg and throwing the overhand. Anytime he ducked in for the legs and Umar threw his hips back and they came into like a clinch, he'd break with the right hand on the chin. I thought Merab's right hand looked really good in this fight. Umar's jab was looking great in this one. Umar doing the knee raises to threaten and try to get Merab stepping back. Ray Longo doesn't get enough credit as a coach. I saw someone say he's authored a number of the biggest upsets in the sport, and that's true. He both Weidman fights against Silva, Serra versus GSP, so that's 3 of them just off the bat. Turned Aljo into a remarkably successful striker in light of the fact that we all look at his striking and go, that's awful. But he's the one saying he's moving his head, punch his chest. He's the one saying you're getting low kicked, put your knee on his shin. And he was the one in this fight saying you're only getting hit when you back up, stay in his face. And as soon as Merab returned to getting, if you watch the replay of that first couple of punches that hurt him in the first round, or maybe it's the second, but where Umar raises the knee and steps through, he raises his left knee and steps through with a 1-2 into orthodox. Merab gets caught because he backs up and drops his hands at the same time. He's like reaching out for the kick while backing up. And if he just stayed in Umar's face, he'd have been fine. And he was for the rest of the fight. I really liked in round 3, Merab had probably lost 1 and 2. And Ray Longo's like, you've got to go out there and get some takedowns. You've got to go out there and make stuff happen if we are down 2 rounds. And I really liked that when Merab came out to do that, it was pretty obvious that was what he was going to do. So Umar immediately throws a knee, which Merab sort of head fakes and then pulls back from. And then he picks up his knee as if to do it again and throws a body kick. Like he turns over a question mark kick into the body, which I loved. Linked with some stuff we talked about from that fight with Kazuki Osaki versus Jin Mandakoro. If you've got a short guy trying to pressure in on you, throw knees up the middle, and if he stands back when you throw the knees, start turning them over into kicks. Mandakoro was doing it into low kicks, which wasn't like as hard as a regular low kick, but it was scoring. And we talked about the interview that Umar did where he was like, how's Merab going to win? He can't control me on the ground. we talked about like everyone's reaction to that was, oh, have you watched him fight? Because he doesn't need to. He's just going to do takedowns, throw you on the mat, and then let you get back up and just stay on top of you and not let you do anything. Stay on top of you on the feet, that is, like pressure-wise. He doesn't hold people down, typically, too much. He just keeps applying pressure and hitting takedowns. And you have to defend the takedowns, otherwise he will just throw you to the mat. And you have to get back up, otherwise he will just drop on top of you and take the easy ride out the round. It's like, you knew Umar was pretty much toast in those last couple of rounds when Merab threw him to the mat, did his usual taunt thing, which I'm going to talk about taunts in a second because he's the master of that. But he stood back and you saw Umar put his hand on the mat, slowly get up to his knee and sort of wheezingly get up off the mat. And it's like, well, you might have been better just staying there if that's the visual you're giving the judges right now. But in terms of visuals with judges, Merab, it's crazy. I'm seeing people come out of this going like, oh, he dominated him and stuff. And he didn't. He won a competitive fight by pouring it on really hard in the last 3 rounds. But people do this. They think that Merab's posturing means that he could finish the guy at any time. It goes back to Anderson Silva versus Damian Maia. But if you are a good fighter and you showboat, you can get away with doing less against dangerous opponents. And a certain number of fans will assume it's because you were going to kill them and you were just trying to humiliate them. Merab couldn't have finished this fight. Merab couldn't have finished Henry Cejudo in that awful Anaconda attempt he tried. But he had him there, and so he's like headbanging for 30 seconds, and the booth and the crowd are going, Cejudo might die here. It's just so stupid. But it is an example of like, he was defending a takedown and got into a front headlock. He could have just been defending a takedown. And Aldo lost the fight against Merab defending a takedown. He wasn't taken down. There were no points scored for the takedown, but Merab won the fight on who looked like they were doing more. Had Aldo been sticking his tongue out and been like, oh, I'm in control of this one, maybe he'd have won those rounds. But a very impressive performance from Merab. So brilliant to see. And his shorts didn't look shit, actually. I thought Makhachev's shorts did still look. I didn't even see the mountains on them in the actual fight. They looked a bit shit. But Merab's, they were plain, but they were cool. I liked them. Right, let's talk about this one. Jiri Prochazka versus Jamahal Hill. Just to annoy the people who get mad at me saying Jiri. These boys came out and banged, as was promised, and they delivered. For whatever reason, Jiri Prochazka has found the time to make a change. Having gone from the first Pereira fight and done nothing about his style to fix it, he's now finally doing something different, and his head movement looked really good in this one. He's always had a bit of head movement. He's always been able to jab, pull, and then try and counter. But in this one, he's coming out orthodox, he's faking his left shoulder, and then he's stepping off to his left, switching into southpaw, slipping whatever Jamahal Hill has thrown or hasn't thrown, and then coming back with a southpaw left hand. And he did that time and time again, and it worked really well. Every Jamahal Hill jab from southpaw, or every Jamahal Hill right straight from orthodox, he managed to slip for the most part. And it's just trying to be elusive. I think a lot of people, even fighters, seem to think that you only move your head when you see something coming. One of the easiest ways to start putting pressure on people and winning exchanges is throw a punch and immediately move your head, and then throw 2 more punches. You don't even have to see what's coming back. You just have to move your head and then throw again. Now, if you don't see what's coming back, at some point you're going to lean into something, which will be worse than if you just took it standing still. But that's how easy it is to make use of the concept of moving your head. Because having the opponent throw at you creates openings, and you moving your head makes it more likely that they miss and that you get into range to exploit those openings. And to be fair, Hill came out and threw some low kicks in the first round, and Prochazka immediately started pulling his lead leg back. Even using that longer stance, he was able to withdraw his lead leg, and it's like, yes, that's what I've wanted all along. And luckily, Hill tried it twice and then gave up. But it would have been interesting to see what happened if he stuck to his guns. What I quite liked from Hill was that he made the read that Jiri was dropping his head quite a lot. So he tried to hit him with a knee, tried to hit him with a couple of uppercuts, and he tried to grab the head when Jiri leaned down, which, looked to the best guy in the sport, Makhachev, when he fought Alexander Volkanovski. If their head is ever lower than yours, grab it and try and hit them with knees, particularly if they're leaning. Gary Goodridge had success doing that against Igor Vovchanchin back in the day, and Gary Goodridge had no right to be out striking Igor Vovchanchin. But he noticed that after every punch, Vovchanchin weaved low. So if he was still standing after a punch, he'd go, right, do your job, knee him in the head. You saw a couple of the Jiri special where he waves his hand and throws the front kick underneath it. Love that. But yeah, Jiri dropped him in the first round. They had a competitive rest of the round. They had a competitive second round. And then Jiri caught him in the third and just did not let up. I was genuinely very impressed. And also, I really like Jiri Prochazka as a person. Or at least what I see of him. He's a very funny guy. He might be on a spectrum or some kind of mentally ill, but he does so in quite a harmless way. And when he gets asked a question at the presser, and they go like, "Who do you think is going to win out of the main and co-main event?" and he closes his eyes as if to like consult his deepest soul, and then answers 10 seconds later. I just love that. But, this is a guy who came from being a football hooligan, so a really negative life path that's just not helping anyone. And he's managed to turn that into, even if you believe that all the weeb stuff is silly bollocks, he has certainly managed to improve his life and be a better influence on people around him. And I bring that up because I was thinking about when he got poked in the eye in this one, he's like not at all bothered. He's saying, no problem, it happens. And he managed to clear his head and get straight back into it. So that kind of surprised me because just most recently, we all remember him getting very upset about Alex Pereira's shamanic blessing or curse or whatever that worked as. For him to get so upset about that when Jamal Hill just jammed one of the worst eye pokes I've seen recently, jammed his fingers fully in Jiri's eye, and Jiri seemed to be like, yeah, can't hate the player, hate the game. just took it like a stone golem, took his time, came out, shook his hands, bowed, went back to it, came out for the third round after all the stuff that Hill had said in the pre-fight about Jiri and his style and how, Hill's clearly the better fighter and stuff, all the trash talk, and Jiri still comes out for round 3 and he's like, let's have a handshake and a hug, right back to work, and then knocks him out. He's a very interesting and compelling character. I can see why people like him so much. This is an arena that the moment that Barcelos was beating Talbott was chanting USA, USA, which I always think, like, I'm not just going to cheer for a Brit just because they're a Brit, because if I know them, they might be a knobhead. But this arena were just like 100% on board with the Czech samurai instead of the American fighter. Very funny. Jailton Almeida versus Sergey Spivak. If you'd asked me about this one maybe a year and a half ago, I'd have gone, damn, that's a fun fight. And then recently, I've been like, I watched Jailton do nothing from the top against Derek Lewis in a dominant fight, which people are now retconning that as like, oh, he was fun. It wasn't fun. It was not fun. It was impressive. There was some cool technical stuff in there, but it wasn't fun. And Sergey Spivak, I watched him improve for a bit and then lose easily to Aspinall and Garn. But these boys came out and they had a banger. Spivak hits a beautiful judo throw, because of course he does. Almeida on the bottom of close guard, opens his guard, lets Spivak step over the leg into half guard, sits up on the underhook, pulls him forward, gets his butt off his heels so that he can expose that leg, start coming up on the Lucas Leitch style half guard. Probably the most powerful sweep for the most average person. If you aren't going to do crazy inversions, if you aren't going to push people out and try and berimbolo them in grappling, this is your go-to game. Lucas Leitch used it against... Buchecha is like 270 pounds of can invert, can do backflips and stuff. And Lucas Leitch is like a welterweight size. And I believe he beat Buchecha in the gi with his guard. But he's used it on all kinds of sizes of people. It's a really powerful place to be. You saw a lot of guys working for the dogfight in this card. It can happen a lot of ways. Merab tried to take Umar down, and Umar tried to whizzer throw him, and they ended up in the dogfight, which is where you get to if you do the Lucas Leitch half guard, and Merab just limp-armed out of it. But Almeida is very good at sweeping to the top position with it. He did it against Derek Lewis as well. And he ended up straight in mount on Spivak. And what I loved was Spivak did something that I talked about Derek Lewis doing against Jailton Almeida. And I went back and watched Derek Lewis do it against a few people. If you get mounted at heavyweight, mount is sort of a mixed position in MMA because guys aren't good at striking from there. But if a heavyweight like cross faces you or puts his hand under your, he puts the old R-word hand choke on you, pushes you flat and hits you in the face with the other hand, you might be unconscious after one, to be honest. So you got to get out of there. Derek Lewis bridges and rolls, which you can do from underneath someone, but they'll put their hand on the mat. But he bridges and rolls with the intention of grabbing that hand as he's turned his back. So he grabs the hand and then he pulls it basically over his shoulder. So he's pulling Almeida onto his back. He's saying, go on, give me a strangle. And then he continues rolling. So Almeida is on Derek Lewis's back, but they're both belly up at the ceiling. And the difference, of course, is that you're then just fighting the hands. You're not getting hit. And Spivak did exactly the same thing against Almeida here. He gave up his back in like the, oh my God, don't do that, that's day one shit sort of way. And then he grabbed the hand, pulled it around himself and rolled through and said, okay, right, now we're having a nice technical grappling exchange where I don't have to worry about being smoked by punches. And if you're in MMA and you're pretty good, you are normally able to turn back into them and end up in their closed guard, especially because heavyweights are going to have worse luck trying to like hoist themselves off the mat and climb over your back. So he ends up on top of Almeida. Almeida opens his guard, gets a butterfly hook as Spivak's trying to step over it and sweeps him. It was gorgeous. But they scramble up and he throws some strikes and everyone goes, oh my God, Jailton Almeida had strikes. And he cracked Spivak. And it turns out when a 250-pound man throws strikes, they do hurt. So anyone who was wondering if Jailton Almeida doesn't throw strikes because he's pillow-fisted or something, turns out not to be true. And Almeida got the stoppage. Was that the long game? Was he waiting 10 fights into his UFC career to throw some strikes just to get a free victory? It was all a trick play. He stopped halfway through and he said, I have a confession. I'm not really left-handed. Yeah, I thought it was great. I think they both look great. As much as you can hope for technically from a heavyweight fight, and also exciting, because technical heavyweight fights sometimes turn into just boring slogs. Reinier Derrida versus Kevin Holland. Wow, what a turnaround for Derrida, because he was struggling with Gerald Meerschaert. His takedowns had looked pretty bad against Meerschaert and Malakin, who he was just like reaching out and trying to headlock. Comes out against Kevin Holland, immediately throws the jab, and Kevin Holland immediately tries to counter, and then he just ducks on his legs and gets a perfect takedown. Wonderful. Almost as good as Cam. I mean, what can't be much different than the amount of time it took Khamzat to get him off his feet. And then Holland threw up I think an omoplata attempt at one point, but Derrida stood in his guard and basically put his knee from the outside of the legs on Holland's hip and turned around him into sort of a reverse knee on belly. It was a very ramshackle pass, but Holland gave up his back. Derrida climbed on, got the body triangle, and then Holland sort of stopped fighting the hands. And people asked the question, why is it flirting when Kevin Holland gives up as soon as the fight isn't in the area that he's good, but when Bob Sapp does it, it's harassment? But Holland's like Neil Magny. He's comfortably always going to be good enough to be in the UFC. If the fight starts going badly, he can go, well, I get half pay this time. We'll do it again in 3 months against someone else, and maybe they'll just let me knock them out and get a bonus. Shout-outs to Derrida, regular listener of the podcast. And the best Dutch middleweight mixed martial artist I've ever seen, ellipses. Nothing more to be said. Right, so then you had the big hype train derailment of Payton Talbott, who I was really hot on. I'm still really hot on, but, respect to Raoni Barcelos, because he came into the UFC as a wrestler. I think he was a Brazilian champion in wrestling, and he had a BJJ black belt and stuff, but he'd been surprising people with his hands, and he had a really good little early run. Holliber, Gutierrez, the Chris Gutierrez they tried to push. Said Nurmagomedov, Taha, lost the majority decision to Timur Valiev in a really good back-and-forth fight. Then he got overwhelmed by Victor Henry, and he just started to look old recently. But this one, he came out and he pursued the takedown off the bat, hung with him on the feet, but really, was on focus. He was never forgetting what he was there to do. And Talbott really struggled. One of the funny things about this fight is that the last time Talbott fought was one of about 15 fights that year in the UFC where someone came out, opened with a hard low kick, and immediately got blasted on one leg. And it wasn't a counter. Payton Talbott said afterwards it wasn't a counter. It's often not a counter. It's that early in the fight, you haven't got the read on whether they're stepping forward when they want to step forward or if they'll step back when you do something. And then if you step in to throw a low kick and they step in to punch at the same time, you're getting smoked. And it happened loads last year, and I don't know why. I'm always saying, just take a second before you start low kicking. And Payton Talbott's last opponent, that's what happened. Payton Talbott said, I didn't even try to counter him. I just stepped forward with 1-2, and it turned out he was on one leg and got smoked. Talbott did exactly the same thing here. He opened with a hard low kick, and Barcelos was stepping in and just grabbed the leg. And that was the first takedown, basically. There was some cool stuff on the ground. When Talbott escaped in the first round from bottom side control, he got the underhook, he gave him a bump with his hips and his knee, and he turned in on the single, which is the classic way to get up. When he tried to do that again in the third round, Barcelos waited for the bump and just stepped over into mount. And that's something that Marcelo Garcia used to do all the time. And Marcelo Garcia would omoplata people from the top. He'd do a monoplata, he'd do a spiral armbar, which is something you never see anyone else do. But it all came off giving the guy the underhook on the bottom and knowing that he's going to bridge to get your weight off him and turn into you. So when he bridges, you just lean off and step high over him and then smush his hips flat to the mat. And it also meant that he was under Talbott's elbows and ready to start attacking. Talbott did better in round 2 and then better again in round 3, but the commentators were saying it and Dean Thomas was saying it, but his stance is so high and he basically walks forward. He's not in a stance the whole time. He's just walking along after the guy, which means he puts tremendous pressure on people because he just keeps walking up to them. And I watched his fights in Uriah Faber FC or whatever it's called, A1 FC. A lot of the time he's just pushing with his hands to get people off him. A lot of those early fights, he's sort of wrestling but punching. He's counter wrestling and punching. He's not really out there kickboxing with guys because they don't want to kickbox with him. But in this one, he could have done with putting another line of defense in between Barcelos and his legs. Once he realized that Barcelos' whole game plan was taking him down and he was struggling a bit, that's when you widen up the stance a bit, you throw uppercuts. If you're staying in a high stance, start picking up your knees and threatening to knee him in the head, because at least then you got him thinking about something. But instead he's walking forward, trying to hit him with right hands and knock him out, which obviously you want to do, but it does create those openings for him to dive underneath you like he did in the second round and get the takedown. I think a fair prospect loss, or we could just put it down to the Samson effect of cutting his hair, cutting his beautiful, beautiful hair. But we'll see what happens. I mean, people have lost to worse fighters in worse performances and gone on to win world titles, so I wouldn't write him off just yet, but I think really more one of those fights that we love when an old guy shows that he's still got it. Maybe he doesn't have it, but he's got something and he's smart enough to put it all together. One of my favourite fights ever, and it's not even a good fight, but 45-year-old Mark Coleman with hip replacement or whatever, just walloping Stephan Bonner because he was supposed to be so washed and he just turned back the clock a little bit for one night. And people weren't even going berserk over it. It was great listening to the commentary booth go, oh wow, Coleman's actually really dominating Stephan Bonner here, who's 10, 15 years younger than him. Was there anything else fun on that card? No, I think we'll save the rest of the undercard for the Boycast this week. There's stuff to talk about from Grant Dawson, Diego Ferreira, but mainly frustration. Bogdan Guskov is always worth talking about. And the Tercios Sopach fight was good. And Ulanbekov versus Clayton Carpenter. Another, just about gets the win. And for some reason, people are still like, give this guy a title shot. He's unstoppable. It's like, did you watch this fight? Did you watch the Alan Nascimento fight? I get that he comes from a great camp, but this is not the guy. Anyway, I thought it was a pretty good event. I had some fun. No UFC next weekend, so I might just write something. I might write something about this card, actually. Some of the grappling and the striking on this card was fun. And then we got Adesanya versus Imavov, which also has Shara Bullet versus Michael Page. Do you know what? That's what we call a striker's delight in the business. That's the sort of card I should write something about. And then I will, and they'll all wrestle. But whatever I write, I'll probably put it up for free. So keep checking thefightprimer.com or go to the Patreon and just sign up as a free member because you can always see what I'm doing over there. I'm your boy, Jack Slack. I'll be back on the Boycast for the Patreon boys later this week. If you want to send an email to the podcast, jackslackpodcast@gmail.com. Diego Ferreira driving 7 hours to train specifically under this coach and then ignoring him in the fight. Bless.